Hi mums, and welcome to Did You Know? Fast Facts on intuitive eating versus calorie counting. Okay, so from a diet perspective, you really have two options. You can either go down the intuitive eating path versus you can go down the calorie counting path. They're the two general. There are obviously other ways in which you can do it, but this is really the two major pathways you can go. Now, from an intuitive eating perspective, essentially what intuitive eating is, you are allowing your appetite to direct your eating pattern and frequency. And all that means is that as you get hungry, you would then eat. Whereas if you were, say, calorie counting, you would have your calories spread out over a specific time of the day, and you would be assigning when you're going to eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you would spread those calories out. Whereas with intuitive eating, you may not actually get hungry until, say, lunchtime. And so your first meal would happen then, and then you sort of wait again until you get hungry, and then you would eat as your hunger dictated. With intuitive eating, there obviously is that focus on natural eating cues, and it is about food quality rather than quantity. So you're not counting calories, you're particularly paying attention to the types of foods that you're eating. It really focuses in on trying to eat for enjoyment, whereas calorie counting can become quite clinical. Intuitive eating often does not have anything off limits. The attention is paid to your satiation, which just means to satiety, to your hunger. And the idea is to eat to satisfaction, not fullness. So you're not eating to a point of being full, you're just eating to a point where you're satisfied. So as an example, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, starving hungry, 10 being absolutely chockers. With intuitive eating, you're sort of wanting to stop about a 7 out of 10. And that would then probably, as our appetite is controlled via the neuroendocrine system, so you've got hormones and the nervous system playing a role in our appetite and our sense of fullness. So it does take a while for our fullness to be registered by the brain. So if you stop eating at about a 7 out of 10, by the time the hormones and the nerves have an ability to transmit messages around the body, your fullness will probably have risen another level. So you always want to eat to under full, otherwise you're just going to be stuffed. Calorie counting, on the other end, it's very structured, and the problem, I guess, here with calorie counting is that calories are going to be consumed regardless of hunger. So I can remember, having a chat to people who were doing Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig, and they had the point system, and people are like, "Oh, I've got 3 points left. I'm going to have X, Y, Z." Having no thought as to whether or not they're hungry, having no thought about whether or not they actually needed to have that food. They just went, well, I've got those points available, and so they ate. The eating is very structured, as I just said, and it's calculated based on your weight and your activity levels. And your fullness is not necessarily a factor in that, as I pointed out, people have got free points or points left over from the day, and rather than going, well, I'm not actually hungry, so I'm not going to use them, they're like, well, I've got to use these points, and so they would eat. And conversely, on the other side, they may have used all their points and still be starving, but they wouldn't eat because they don't have any more points left. So in terms of the pros and cons of these systems, now this is not exhaustive, this is just, some general things. With intuitive eating, some of the pros are that it's very relaxed, it's flexible, you're not having these dietary rules and forbidden foods, and that makes it feel like you're not on a diet. And from a longevity perspective, it will promote longevity. There's no tracking of food, it's not stressful, it's very easy. So again, longevity wise, there's a lot of reasons as to why people would be able to stick with it. In terms of the cons, though, it's really easy to overeat, really easy, because you're not really, you're not tracking anything, not measuring anything. So what you think is a teaspoon might actually be a tablespoon. And you may not think that's a big difference, but if you're doing that consistently all day, you're actually going to end up overeating. You're just going to end up eating a lot more than you realize. And the problem also with intuitive eating is that relying on your appetite is actually a skill. And if you have metabolic derangement, or metabolic damage, or better way of putting it is metabolic syndrome. If you have metabolic syndrome, there's a good chance that your appetite can't quite be trusted. So you're probably going to be feeling hungry all the time. And if you're allowing your appetite to direct your eating, and your appetite is always set to slightly on, you're going to be hungry all day. And that's going to make it very difficult to be able to use intuitive eating as a a successful dietary tool. A con is that there's no tracking of food, which can mean, again, you may not be aware of what you've been eating. There's a tendency to become an emotional eater as well, because sometimes our emotions trigger our appetite. And when you're not skilled at intuitive eating, you can then think that you are truly hungry. It can become so flexible that you're just eating everything. It definitely requires discipline. So if you're not particularly disciplined with your food, intuitive eating may not be right for you. And there's less consideration for energy consumption. And just that, what that just means is that you just think, well, I'm just going to eat whatever I feel like at a particular time. And you don't consider necessarily what it is you're eating and how much energy is in the food that you're eating. Okay, so with the calorie counting, there are some pros. I'm not completely against calorie counting. I think it's very inaccurate, but I think there's some real strengths of calorie counting. Number one is that you're really clear on what you're eating. It also controls variables, which means when you aren't achieving the results that you want, you can go back and figure out, okay, well, maybe this is where I'm going wrong. And as I said, when you're tracking with calories, you know, when you're using a teaspoon of something, you are using a teaspoon of something. You might be thinking you're having a teaspoon of peanut butter, but in fact, you're having a tablespoon and you're having that 3 times a day. That ends up being a huge amount more than what you thought. So you, with the tracking and the measuring, you are just reducing the variables and reducing the places for things to go wrong. There is an increase in mindful eating. So you are paying attention to what you're doing because you've got to track it. It can also be very useful for helping you identify any nutritional imbalances. And what we know about the micronutrient content of food is that it plays a very key role in regulating our appetite. And when our diet is deficient in micronutrients, that can actually be a trigger for us to overeat. It can cause us to become hungry, and our body tries to capture these additional micronutrients by just making you hungry, so you just eat a lot more food. So making sure that we're not actually eating an imbalanced diet. Calorie counting also gives you a sense of control. The cons of calorie counting is that it's very rigid. It can create a lot of stress and anxiety around food. It doesn't feel particularly pleasurable. It becomes quite clinical. It is inaccurate and it's very time consuming. The thing about the inaccuracies of calorie counting is that those inaccuracies generally continually exist. So it is inaccurate, but it is consistently inaccurate. It can shift away from food quality. So people become so focused in on the numbers that they actually aren't looking at where it is they're getting their calories from. And the problem also is that when calorie counting doesn't work, people say, well, what are you doing wrong? So it puts the blame on the person instead of going, well, it could just be that the inaccuracies are so great that it's not your calculations, it's that the inaccuracies exist in the equations and in the food calculations. Okay, team, that is a very quick summary of intuitive eating versus calorie counting. I hope it made sense. I will see you for the next lesson. All right, bye everybody.